I had just finished arranging the small vase of tulips on my kitchen counter when my phone buzzed. A text from Benjamin flashed across the screen. "Happy belated birthday. Mom, sorry, I forgot, didn't mean to. Why didn't you remind me?" My fingers froze over the keyboard. 3 days late, and the excuse was as hollow as it sounded. The words burned. Not because they were unkind, but because they exposed the truth I had been pretending not to see. For years, my son and his family valued me more for what I could provide than for who I was. I thought back to decades of driving to Westchester for Sunday dinners, baking chocolate cake after chocolate cake, sending checks for school tuition, down payments, renovations, vacations. Every request had been met with a smile and a check. Every birthday, wedding, or milestone accounted for without hesitation. And yet here I was, ignored on the one day that mattered to me, treated like a stranger rather than the mother who had carried him, nurtured him, and given him the foundation to live comfortably. The anger swelled quickly, but beneath it was something sharper clarity. For the first time, I recognized the pattern I had long excused: Benjamin's dependence, Ava's subtle dismissals, the children absorbed in their devices, the unspoken expectation that my generosity was endless. My late husband, Richard, had worked tirelessly to build our family's security, and I had continued that legacy blindly, letting their entitlement grow unchecked. I knew I couldn't let this slide. I wouldn't just wait for an apology that would likely never come. Something had to change, and it had to start now. I tapped out a quick message to my attorney, already forming the outlines of a plan in my mind. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of my Manhattan apartment, I realized the rules had changed and that the next move was entirely mine. For as long as I could remember, Sundays were reserved for Westchester. I would leave my Manhattan apartment early in the morning, driving the familiar route along the Sawmill Parkway, rehearsing stories I hoped might catch Olivia and Ethan's attention long enough to look up from their screens. I carried boxes of homemade chocolate cake, fresh cookies, and sometimes little treats Richard and I had always given them as children. For years, the house was alive with warmth, the laughter of grandchildren, the quiet approval of Benjamin when he hugged me, Ava's polite questions about my week. It was enough to make me feel that my efforts mattered. But over time, the warmth dimmed. Benjamin's greetings became cursory. Ava's attention strayed constantly to her phone or her next shopping list. And the children, Olivia and Ethan, retreated into their tablets and devices. I tried to excuse it. They were busy, distracted, growing up in a world I didn't fully understand. I told myself I was lucky they still tolerated my presence, that I had the chance to see them regularly. And yet, as the years passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. Each check I wrote for tuition, each repair or renovation I funded, every birthday or graduation gift I sent, felt less like appreciation and more like expectation. The subtle neglect, the dismissive glances, the lack of effort to inquire about my life, the silence when I spoke about my own concerns, added up until the nostalgia I once clung to turned bitter. I realized that my generosity had become a crutch for them, not a gesture of love. I remembered the early days after Richard passed, when I thought our family would pull closer together in grief. Instead, I had become the safety net they leaned on without reciprocation. It was a quiet, creeping frustration, the kind that builds in small increments until it erupts. I knew now that these years of sacrifice had to be acknowledged, not just for them to understand, but for me to reclaim the respect I had long given freely. The realization that love and financial support could be so misunderstood settled like a weight on my shoulders as I prepared to confront the next stage of this long-standing imbalance. The first real shock came unexpectedly. over lunch at my favorite cafe in Manhattan. Thomas Green, who had worked with Richard for decades and now advised Benjamin on investments, stopped by my table. He asked how I was holding up, and I mentioned the birthday text from Benjamin, thinking it would be casual conversation. But then his eyes darkened, and he hesitated. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I assumed you knew about Benjamin's tech investment last year. It didn't go well. He lost a substantial amount." I blinked, unsure I'd heard correctly. Substantial. How much, I asked. My voice tight. Thomas's discomfort made the answer worse. He fumbled through words, finally saying, "Enough to worry." Especially considering his existing credit card debt, I felt my stomach drop. Debt investments. None of this had been mentioned to me. Not a word. The $30,000 check I had written the month before for school fees and taxes now felt like a drop in a widening ocean. The realization that Benjamin had been hiding this from me for months, years, perhaps cut deeper than any anger I had felt over a forgotten birthday. By that evening, I was sitting in my apartment, stirring my tea, and thinking clearly for the first time in years, how much had I truly given, and how much did I not know? The trust fund Richard had established to protect Benjamin and his family had become a crutch they leaned on without responsibility. I could see it now, the checks, the gifts, the silent approvals they were enabling entitlement, not love. The next morning, I called James Richardson, our family attorney. "I need a full accounting of everything I've provided Benjamin over the last 5 years," I said without preamble. There was a pause on the line, his quiet caution obvious. "Are you sure you want to go down this road?" he asked. "I need to know," I said firmly. 2 days later, sitting in James's office, I stared at the spreadsheet in front of me. House down payments, tuition, renovations, vacations, personal gifts over $800,000 in direct contributions, not counting the trust fund distributions. Each number felt like a betrayal carved into paper. I felt a rising tide of shock and anger, but underneath it, there was something else, clarity. I realized that if love alone had kept me enabling them for decades, it had also blinded me to manipulation. The time for passive generosity had ended, and the first steps toward strategy and empowerment were already taking shape in my mind. I knew the next move would be decisive, and the moment of confrontation could not be delayed. I spent the morning sitting at my kitchen table. The spreadsheet from James Richardson spread before me. Every number was a reminder, every total a silent accusation. House down payments, renovations, tuition, credit card payments, vacations over $800,000 I had given Benjamin and his family in just 5 years. And that didn't even include the trust fund distributions set up after Richard passed. The realization hit me like a freight train for decades. I had been playing a role I hadn't signed up for, the perpetual provider, the invisible safety net. I picked up the phone and dialed James. "We need to make some changes," I said, my voice steady. I explained that I wanted to suspend all trust fund distributions immediately and block Benjamin and Ava's access to any accounts I controlled personally. James hesitated, as if he expected me to falter. "Margaret, this will provoke a reaction." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "I need them to understand that the era of taking me for granted is over." By late morning, the first texts arrived. Benjamin's phone buzzed incessantly. "Mom, please answer me. Something must be wrong." I didn't respond. Soon after, Ava's name appeared on my caller ID. Her tone was sharper than I expected, a mixture of panic and disbelief. "Margaret, what are you doing? We can fix this. Don't do anything rash." I let the calls ring, one after another, savoring the quiet I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't cruelty that kept me from answering. It was clarity. For the first time, I held the cards. Every frantic ring and pleading text was evidence of their reliance, their entitlement. I realized that for years, I had been nurturing dependence rather than love. Their panic confirmed it. They were terrified of losing access to money, not of losing connection to me. By afternoon, the texts turned desperate. Benjamin promised change, offered excuses, asked for reassurance. Ava tried a different tactic, a mix of charm and guilt, attempting to manipulate me back into compliance. I remained silent, letting the moment stretch, observing the patterns I had ignored for so long. The situation was no longer a negotiation of generosity. It was a test of boundaries and respect. As the day drew on, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't known since Richard was alive. This was more than money. It was control over my life, a reclaiming of dignity and agency that had been eroded quietly over decades. I had set the stage, and now they would have to respond to the consequences of their own actions. I turned my attention to the calendar, noting the first Sunday dinner since this decision. The anticipation of that confrontation filled the apartment with a quiet tension. What they didn't realize yet was that this wasn't just about finances. It was about respect, and I intended to make them understand that fully. The next morning, I found a bouquet of white roses on my kitchen counter, along with a small card signed by Benjamin and Ava. "Thinking of you. Love always." It read. The gesture was out of place, unfamiliar in its timing and presentation, and it immediately set off an alarm in my mind. I knew the roses weren't meant to celebrate me. They were meant to soften me, to make me forget the reality I had confronted them with yesterday. Later that day, Olivia's voice came through on the phone, cheerful and rehearsed. "Hi, Grandma. Just wanted to tell you about my day at school." The words sounded carefully chosen, almost scripted. She detailed classes, friends, and projects with a precision that felt unnatural, as though she were reading from a prompt. I realized then that Benjamin and Ava had coached her, turning her into an instrument for their performance. Every sentence, every tone of feigned enthusiasm was meant to manipulate me into reconsidering my decision. By evening, a handwritten letter arrived from Ethan. His handwriting was unusually neat, almost unnatural for a 12-year-old. "Dear Grandma, I've been thinking about how awesome you are. I hope we can spend more time together." Sweet as it seemed, the letter bore the subtle imprint of parental oversight. This was not a spontaneous act of affection. It was calculated, designed to elicit guilt. Calls and texts began to pile up. Benjamin's voice over the phone was syrupy, concerned about my health, asking trivial questions he had never cared about in years. Ava's messages alternated between polite charm and veiled reproach, pressuring me to lift the boundaries I had set. I listened, quietly cataloging every phrase, every pattern, recognizing the old strategies they had always used when money was involved. The realization struck me fully. Their attention was no longer genuine. It was performative. They were trying to manipulate my emotions to restore their access to the wealth they had grown dependent on, to regain control over the life I had spent decades building. As the day ended, I sat back in my chair, a cold clarity settling over me. I understood that this was only the beginning. The gestures, the letters, the orchestrated affection, they were the first layer of a larger scheme, one that threatened not just my finances, but my autonomy and legacy. I needed to see the full extent before deciding my next move. I opened my phone to review the day's messages once more, realizing that uncovering the truth behind this performative affection would require more than intuition. It would require investigation. I hired Patricia Chen, a private investigator James had recommended years ago, to look into Benjamin and Ava's finances. What I had suspected as manipulation now required proof, and I was determined not to let intuition be mistaken for paranoia. Patricia worked quickly, combing through bank records, property titles, and unusual transactions that had gone unnoticed under the guise of normal family dealings. The first report arrived late one afternoon. Offshore accounts. Multiple wire transfer attempts that had been declined. Large sums funneled through shell companies. A life insurance policy in which I was the insured. And Benjamin was the beneficiary, taken out without my knowledge. My hands shook as I read each line, the reality settling like ice in my veins. It wasn't just financial carelessness. It was deliberate, calculated, and sustained over years. Patricia's next discovery confirmed my worst suspicions. Benjamin had consulted a psychiatrist, ostensibly for general advice, but the notes indicated he was exploring legal steps to establish guardianship over me, claiming I might be incapable of managing my finances. I felt my chest tighten. My own son had quietly set a plan in motion, one that would have stripped me of autonomy while maintaining access to every penny I had earned and managed. Anger surged first, sharp and hot, then cooled into a focused clarity. Every gift I had given, every check I had written, every act of generosity over the decades had been leveraged as a tool against me. I realized the flowers, the rehearsed letters from the children, the false concern they were part of a layered strategy to make me appear unstable, to push me into compliance, to normalize the idea that I needed their oversight. I called James Richardson immediately. "We have a serious problem," I said. I outlined the evidence: offshore accounts, attempted wire transfers, the life insurance policy, and the psychiatrist consultations. James listened, the weight of it clear in his voice. "Margaret, this is elder abuse. It's systematic. You have to act carefully, but decisively." I knew what I had to do. First, protect Olivia and Ethan. I made arrangements for them to spend time with me outside the Westchester house, ensuring their safety and emotional stability while the confrontation played out. Second, I needed Patricia to continue gathering evidence, creating an unassailable record of their deception. And finally, I had to prepare myself to face Benjamin and Ava with the full truth, to assert control over my life and my legacy. Sitting in my apartment that evening, the quiet hum of Manhattan below, I felt a mixture of betrayal and strategic fury. I had always loved my family, but love alone had allowed manipulation to flourish. Now, it would be my determination and clarity that set the rules. The next step would be the confrontation, a reckoning that could not be postponed and could not fail. I told James Richardson I would confront Benjamin and Ava myself. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me further or pretend their orchestrated gestures had redeemed years of entitlement. I scheduled a meeting at my Manhattan apartment, neutral, yet firmly under my control, and ensured Patricia Chen would be monitoring the house discreetly. They arrived in the early evening, their faces composed but tense. Benjamin tried to offer a warm greeting, but I noticed the slight stiffness in his posture, the rehearsed brightness in Ava's smile. I gestured for them to sit as I retrieved the folder I had prepared with Patricia's evidence. "Before we discuss anything, I want you to understand the full scope of what I've discovered." I began. I laid out the offshore accounts, the attempted wire transfers, the life insurance policy naming Benjamin as the beneficiary, and the psychiatrist consultations designed to question my competency. I watched their expressions shift from confident to pale, the rehearsed calm unraveling. "This," I continued, "is not a mistake. It's a pattern of deception spanning years. Your reliance on my resources was already excessive, but your attempt to gain legal control over my finances and assets crosses a line that cannot be ignored." Benjamin opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. "There will be no excuses. You will vacate the Westchester house by the end of the month. I am amending my will so that all assets go to Olivia and Ethan when they reach 25, with no access for either of you under any circumstances. I watched Ava's composure falter, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes narrowing in disbelief. I am giving you 30 days, I said firmly. 30 days to demonstrate that you respect me as a person, not a source of income. Any manipulation, any attempt to regain control through deceit will end permanently. You will find alternative housing and manage your own finances. Benjamin. Ava. Do you understand? The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside. Benjamin's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as he finally grasped the seriousness of my words. Ava's hands trembled slightly, betraying the intensity of her shock. I sat back, observing the weight of accountability settle on them both. I reached out toward Olivia and Ethan, who had been quietly watching from the doorway. You will stay with me as long as necessary. Your parents' choices do not affect your safety or well-being. The children's eyes widened, relief softening their features. I leaned back in my chair and allowed the moment to stretch. The confrontation had begun. The truth laid bare. They would either respect these boundaries or face the consequences of their actions. And for the first time in decades, I felt fully in control. The next weeks would test the strength of these boundaries and reveal whether this family could ever rebuild on honesty rather than manipulation. Months had passed since the confrontation, and the quiet in my apartment felt different now, lighter, freer, and more like my own life again. Benjamin had started working at a modest sales position, learning discipline and accountability for the first time in years. Ava had enrolled in therapy to address her spending habits and was taking online courses to update her marketing skills. The house in Westchester had been sold, and they had moved into a smaller apartment, living within their means for the first time in adulthood. Olivia and Ethan were safe and settled, their routines adjusted to stability and honesty. They still spent weekends with me, but their visits no longer felt like performances. They laughed freely, shared stories without prompting, and asked about my life because they genuinely wanted to. Watching them grow and flourish without the pressure of their parents' manipulation was a quiet triumph. I had begun investing time in myself as well. I joined a book club I had long admired, started painting with watercolors in the afternoons, and even began seeing George, a kind widower I had met at a museum lecture. The sense of autonomy and personal fulfillment I had long postponed now felt tangible and exhilarating. I realized that the boundaries I had set weren't just protective, they were liberating. Our family dinners resumed, though under new terms. Benjamin and Ava contributed honestly, without expecting handouts, and the children participated without scripts or coaching. The atmosphere was still cautious, but it was real. For the first time in years, respect and communication had replaced entitlement and deception. The money that had once defined the family's interactions no longer held power over relationships. I reflected often on what Richard and I had built. The true inheritance wasn't the fortune, the house, or the trust fund. It was the chance to foster integrity, accountability, and love lessons Benjamin and Ava were now learning the hard way. It was the knowledge that respect and boundaries were more valuable than any sum of money, and that even in family, one could demand dignity without sacrificing love. As I watched Olivia teaching Ethan a new card game and heard laughter fill the room, I knew the long, painful work had been worth it. I had reclaimed my life, my voice, and my family in a way that could endure. The lessons of patience, courage, and boundaries had finally taken root, and the path ahead, while still challenging, felt filled with possibility and genuine connection.